governance session. Thank you. Naledi, over to you.
Good afternoon. Okay, yeah, no, I've got the graveyard shift, it's fine. Yeah, as Noor mentioned, this session, we're really looking at a People's Digital Rights Charter, and possibly to sort of center our thinking in terms of what would that look like, what are we trying to do. We can actually think of the Freedom Charter, and that as a document that is asking for reform, that is putting down some of the areas that we feel are either not covered or need progression, right? I'm gonna take this down a bit because I do walk around. So yeah, that's, and also thinking about digital rights as legal entitlements. So things that we want to have, and how, and the different perspectives that we want to engage digital rights on, right? So there is what we expect from platforms. There are rights that we want honored and respected as users and consumers on media specifically when you think about social media. Then there is this big giant that everyone is excited about and also scared of, that is AI. And the impact that AI has had. And in this session, we can also think about what we've seen happen lately when it comes to the use of AI and how that information is generated and some of the rights that may have been infringed upon in getting those responses. So those prompts, when you get the prompt and it's telling you this is the right prose, this is the right grammar, is it in likeness to someone else's work? Did that person consent to their work being used in that way? And when we think about access to information, yesterday's session was really exciting, that spoke about slap suits and the protections that exist within that framework. So the defense to slaps. We actually recently had engaged on a matter where the Daily Maverick, someone had run to the High Court on an urgent application saying, no, you will not publish. And we're getting to a point where even before the matters are heard, you know this is not going to be successful. Let the people run the story, particularly when you think about the levels of corruption we're dealing with, that is definitely not an area we can afford to have intimidation, interference. Because it's not like, you know, corrupt actors are going to tell you this is what we are up to. Get on the news and be open and share with us. So particularly when it comes to investigative journalism, it's key in the fight against corruption. So one of our expert inputs that we're going to get now, that will be followed by a session where we take a look at where we are right now and the key components that we need to have in a charter. What we're looking at when we think about digital rights and what's fundamental. So I'd like to ask Uyanda to please come up and share some expert inputs with us. This light is here. So I think I'll move this way a bit here.
So that I can put my... Good afternoon, everyone. Because of my height, I'm going to have to remove this so that you can all see me. So my name is Uyanda Siotula. I am with the SOS Support Public Broadcasting Coalition. And my role here today is to just put a few thoughts down, just to get us thinking about what needs to be incorporated into the People's Digital Rights Charter. So I am going to try to be very brief, even though that's very difficult for me. So I mean, I think one of the key aspects are really in the name itself, a People's Digital Rights Charter. So it has to be people-centered, but at the same time, it also has to advance, the human rights that we value so much. The charter must, advance democratic and constitutional values. So therefore, it needs to be based on the Bill of Rights that is really central to, our democracy. There are also, other frameworks that we can look at on the continent, which is specifically the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which I think is really fundamental in framing, continental protection and advancement of human rights. There are also other global digital rights instruments. I mean, we've seen as the digital space and environment is growing that, there are organizations that are working tirelessly to develop these instruments for us, so that we can better understand the governance of the digital environment. And some of those include the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms, the Global Digital Rights Charter, as well as the European Digital Rights Principles. There's also the UNESCO guidelines on governance and governance of digital platforms. And all these instruments really just set a precedent in terms of what the thinking should be when it comes to a digital rights charter. So coming back locally, we also have the South African Human Rights that has developed a social media charter that can also be useful in this particular context. But also, among the digital instruments that I've mentioned, what has become very clear is that there is a link that cannot be disputed between human rights and digital rights. And also that platforms play an important role in advancing human rights. That also cannot be disputed. However, there is a downfall to it, because as much as they play that critical role in advancing and democratizing access to information, access to culture and the public sphere, there is a downfall where they become ecosystems of mis and disinformation and for online harms, incitement of violence. And in that way, they also then become instruments that undermine our democracies while also threatening human rights. So it is very important that the Charter should emphasize that these human rights that we enjoy in the offline space need to be upheld and enjoyed in the digital environment as well. So I am going to just touch on two or three important rights that I think should be included. So one of them is, equality, and these are found in the Bill of Rights. So equality is something that we really, especially, in South Africa, that it is a right that is very important. So Section 9 of the Constitution talks about equality, and it specifically says equality includes the full and equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. So this section also speaks about non-discrimination, and it lists the various grounds upon which a human being should not be discriminated. And then if you also go to the African Charter contains grounds as well. And I found two very interesting, which is social origin and fortune. And then if we break this down, if you look at social origin, it's about where a person comes from, their origin. Are you from the rural areas or the urban area? And if we look at fortune, it speaks to your financial background, your economic status. So in the offline space, regardless of whether you're poor or rich, you have a right to access water and electricity, so those are basics. So now we need to have the same mentality when it comes to the online space and look at how equality can be defined and how access to these rights can be defined. So in the online space, when we're talking about equality, we're talking about equality to access to the internet, equality to access to devices that enable us to access the digital environment. So, so your cell phones, tablets, whatever device you use. So that also needs to be regardless of your financial background. So therefore, the government also has a role to play to minimize the digital divide, to ensure that there is that accessibility and that people are able to be participatory in these online spaces. But also equality speaks about equality before the law. And if we look at the online environment, we also need digital laws that govern the online space. We need policies that are going to be human-centered. South Africa has done work already. We've got the Cyber Crimes Act. We currently have the digital, Department on Communications and Digital Technologies that's developing a draft white paper that's looking at the regulation of the online space. So all those regulations need to be people-centered. So I think it is important that as the charter is being developed, that the developers keep track of all these policy development so that they can be incorporated accordingly. So there's also the right to life, human dignity, integrity, freedom, and security of people. And I think this one is really important, especially when we look at the public interest media aspect and how it can be preserved. If we look at subsection D, it says, especially in relation to security and protection, it says people should not be tortured in any way, not be treated or punished in a cruel and inhumane and degrading way. But if you look at social media, we look at everything that's happening on social media, is it not torture or dehumanizing of people when people are being bullied, when people are being body shamed, all these online harms that are taking place and unfolding in front of us. The death threats, revenge porn, which is also a big one. So there's also, you spoke earlier about AI. There's also deepfakes. And these deepfakes, to a certain extent, threaten public interest media. We saw, I think a couple of months back, when there was a deepfake that implicated the SABC, because then eventually people are going to lose trust in the public broadcaster because there are individuals that can't tell a real, SABC production and a deepfake. So especially when we then go back to the online harms and the cyberbullying, we know that female journalists are always on the receiving end. They're being bullied, they're being body shamed. And when you do that to journalists, you are saying there are certain spaces, individuals that you can't hold accountable, that you can't write about, that you can't report on, that you cannot expose. And in turn, that threatens the quality of our journalism. So another very important right is Section 16, which is on the freedom of expression. And this needs to be expressly included in the charter. So if we look at subsection on freedom of the press and other media, we can all agree that media is now moving online, right? Print media is shutting down because of sustainability issues, and increasingly people are accessing information in digital spaces. And we've also seen how investigative journalism has grown in the online space. If you look at the Daily Maverick, Amapungane, News 24, it also just means that the online space is becoming a hub for investigative journalism. We also have the traditional broadcasters such as the SABC that are also increasingly moving to the digital space. There's also the SABC Plus, and they're also utilizing other social media platforms to access their audiences. So that shift from traditional and physical media to online, it needs us to think critically about how public interest media needs to be protected in the digital space. So also, in addition to these news-based digital platforms, a vast majority of our people are accessing information on digital platforms. So people go on Facebook, Twitter to see what the latest news are. The downfall regarding that is that tech platforms are using algorithmic manipulation to deprioritize news, and in this context of a digital rights charter, that becomes an infringement to an individual that needs to access information in the digital environment. But also, it does affect the sustainability of our media sector. Media sustainability is already an issue, right? And if we can have platforms, hold platforms accountable for fair sharing revenue models, hold them accountable for prioritizing news and information, and not to disadvantage the producers of news, we can obviously start moving towards a fair digital environment. So that also needs to be carefully thought about and incorporated into the charter. And the protection of public interest media speaks directly to the advancement of information integrity. So this is obviously one of the key ways in ensuring that society has got access to credible information. And I think also there are other developments on the continent that would be important to be considered in this process. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights is currently working with Media Monitoring Africa, the SOS Coalition, the African Alliance on Data Access to develop guidelines. One is on platform accountability, the other is on access to public service content, and the other is on access to data. And these really are instruments that aim to advance information integrity in the digital age. So it would also be useful to keep track of that process and see what could be useful to include here. And looking at the subsection B of section 16 that looks at freedom to receive and impart information and ideas. And I think this really is important as well. Because it talks about every citizen needing to have access to the internet to receive information and be able to share opinions. And this is also because these digital spaces have become platforms for public debate, public information to be shared, and for people to really express themselves. So, so this then takes me to my second last point on digital public rights. On digital public infrastructure, which is also like a big, conversation on the continent and globally, in fact. We know that it is also central to the G20 conversations. The B20 has also touched on it. M20 has also made some recommendations around it. So what are we talking about when we're talking about DPIs? We're talking about a set of shared digital systems built and leveraged by both the public and the private sector, and they need to be based on a resilient infrastructure. But the reason we need a resilient infrastructure is so that people can have access to digital public services, right? And digital public services are very broad across different industries. So we're talking digital payments, digital access, stuff like that. But then if we bring it back to the media, we need to start thinking about digital public services that relate to the media specifically. And in order for government to ensure that there is access to these digital public services, we need a government that's mindful about ensuring that there is access to the internet, so that everybody has got access to the internet, everybody can access information, everybody can participate in these public debates that take place on the online spaces. But it's also access to the media, right? Because if media is moving to the online spaces, what about Uyanda in the rural areas of Eastern Cape that does not have access to the internet? So that individual also needs to freely access the internet. So government has a role to play here. And also there are conversations that need to be held with the telecoms to make data accessible. Because another problem in South Africa is that data prices are very high. But we also have Connect SA that has an obligation to roll out these Wi-Fi hotspots to ensure that there is access to the internet. So government needs to really, really ensure that that role is played and fast-tracked. There's also another important aspect, which is zero rating of public interest content. So this also means that producers of content that serves the public interest would then have their content zero rated, so you would not need data to access that content. That is one way of ensuring sustainability of these organizations, media organizations, while at the same time ensuring that they do have an audience base. And one of those organizations is the SABC, which obviously is a public broadcaster and produces public service content, and therefore needs to have an audience that is able to access that public service content in order to ensure that they are able to participate in our democracy and engage and hold government accountable when necessary. So as I wrap up, so the Charter must ensure that government plays a role in advancing the digital environment as well as information. So there's also just one last element that is important, which is access to digital literacy. Because often access to digital literacy is considered an add-on, but it is very critical because all these concepts we're talking about are new. People don't understand these digital rights, so they need literacy in order for them to be able to also exercise these rights that we're talking about here today. So essentially, the Charter should observe key principles on human rights approach, promoting inclusion, ensuring online freedoms, fostering participation, and enhancing safety and empowerment, while at the same time ensuring that there is a digital transformation that is centered on people and access to credible information. Thank you.
Thank you, Uyanda, for that. I think in a good way, what it does really well, rather, is that it centers our conversation and the type of inputs that we are then looking to have when it comes to the creation of a digital charter. And if we're to maybe engage on why it would be necessary to have one, we need to really look at the type of environment we're in right now in that space. And you had already touched on misinformation and disinformation, even within the context of that as a threat to democracy. Because I think it was Code for Africa that coined this term of manipulative information, that you're being given this information. It's not just disinformation, but it has the motive is to create a narrative that either doesn't exist or that pushes you into sort of some, I want to say right wing, because that's the real issue that we're having, right? You're seeing a proliferation of sort of right wing actors, of sexism, of xenophobia, of homophobic sentiment. So there's an increase in intolerance that is coming as a result of disinformation and misinformation. We also then need to engage from the context of the infringement of rights, of the right to privacy and dignity, particularly within the scope when we see sort of this generative AI. I was very surprised because I think my relationship with AI has been, you think of your Grammarly's, you think of your chat GPTs, then you start thinking about the imaging that comes from it. And at some point there was this trend where you put your picture in and it generates this sort of cartoon-like image of you. And that was still fine in my mind. And then on Now X, there was an image of a woman who just posted a normal picture. And someone asked Grok to undress her. And it wasn't something I'd considered as not just possible, but as necessary. Like, why would you think of that? And it then really calls into question what people are doing and thinking when engaging with other people's images, because he was asking for that to be done on an image that's not his. So even if it were his, it's still inappropriate, it's still sexualizing someone. But for a person to think of asking a bot to do that, is harmful, it's dangerous, and it becomes even worse within the scope of thinking about children. You then have the sort of the theft of intellectual property when it comes to some of the outputs that you see on, particularly when you're doing research and it starts saying, you know, plagiarism, check for plagiarism. And you find that someone is doing the labor of conceptualizing and writing, and then it's coming up elsewhere when someone is submitting an essay that they really haven't worked on, and what's the relationship between the producer of that intellectual work and the end user. So that's one of the protections that I think would need to be engaged on in this session. The other one is doxing, which is seemingly become more and more popular. And within the context of South Africa, when we think about doxing, fortunately, we do have some protections. Whether or not they're efficient, whether or not they're easy to implement is another thing entirely. One of the things that has been touched on already is the Constitution, and we'll touch on that when we start looking at existing frameworks, particularly legal frameworks that we have that would form a good basis in terms of the considerations that would need to be in the Charter. But we have to look at what are the key components of that Digital Rights Charter. We have to think about freedom of speech as a right and as a necessity. We have to think about access to information. We have to think about data protection and privacy. We have to think about transparency and accountability. And this is a big one in South Africa right now, transparency and accountability. I've seen people regularly complain as well that I keep getting calls from these numbers, I block them, how did they get my number? How did they get my number? And for me, it's such an interesting relationship to have with how much control you feel like you have over your own information, and whether you did input it somewhere, and whether or not terms and conditions were read, did I tick them, but were they actually put somewhere where I was most likely not going to read them in a font that is ridiculous, making it more, more likely that you're not going to engage, whether or not there's a relationship that's being entered into when it comes to you and the data that you've put on the platform. User control is another important element that needs to be within a digital rights charter, and inclusion, particularly in the South African context. We've touched on the levels of inequality you see, and the work that the government would have to do to close that gap in ensuring that everyone has access to the internet, and then looking at existing frameworks. The nice thing about South Africa is we've got a constitution that everybody loves. We're very proud of our constitution. Some people hate it. They say it doesn't work. I'm partial to our constitution, and I find it's one, how people are empowered to actually enforce those rights. Do we all have a clear understanding of how you enforce that right, and what space you enforce that right in? And once you have that, then let's have a conversation about it works or it doesn't work, right? So is it an implementation issue, or is the Constitution as a concept the problem? So you've got the Constitution, you've got Section 14, you've got Section 10. They speak to the right to privacy and the right to dignity. And the right to dignity linked to the sort of these AI creations where some are used for bullying, someone's image will be edited, deep fakes. The other is the Promotion of Access to Information Act. Lots of PAIA applications are done in South Africa, and it's really, really good. It compels particularly state actors to give you information that you need. Then you've got the Protection of Personal Information Act. And this is the one where I've seen a lot of time on social media, people engage and say, if they have my number, Kanti, what's POPIA? What's POPIA doing? Why can they do this? And everyone was excited about POPIA. The only reason was that the assumption was that you're not going to get calls from telemarketers. And I don't think we've won on that front. The other interesting piece of legislation that I think could relate to the digital space is the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Act, right? That should, in a way, govern your conduct in what you say, in how you engage people on social media. When we think about, for example, fat shaming, homophobia, ngizwe, last 2 weeks ago, that falls within the ambits of hate speech. Now, some of the limitations we have is if you think about how do you prosecute hate speech? How do you establish that it's hate? It speaks to being able to illustrate intent. It is very difficult in a court of law to paint a picture where you say, this is what this person intended to do. It's almost like you're sitting in their mind and you're saying, this was the motive, this was the desired outcome, therefore it is hate, right? So when we do look at the existing legal frameworks, we understand that there are limitations. And those are limitations that we also need to think about when we are developing the charter. Then you've got the Cyber Crimes Act, which empowers, law enforcement in different ways, and allows them access to sort of your gadgets, which is where a lot of crimes that relate to things like fraud, harassment will take place. So these are the existing frameworks that we have fundamentally in South Africa. Whether or not they're easy to implement, that we will find, either we've got precedents that establish whether or not they are, or alternatively we will see as we go. If you look at the Hate Speech Act, just to shorten it, there are serious complaints around how this legislation is understood and interpreted. And within the digital rights charter, you almost think about how do we implement these reforms that we want, and how do we improve on the legislation that we have that's existing. But the only way I think we can get a realistic and useful perspective on what is necessary is to engage on the lived experiences of people who engage the media, right? So you've got journalists, you've got legal practitioners, you've got content creators, and all of them experience different things when engaging social media. So with this backdrop, with this understanding and some of these components that have been shared, one of the questions that I want to open up to the floor with, and stand up, because I need to feel like I'm coming alive, is to take in those inputs from you that say, this is my experience in the digital space. These are the areas that I think we really need to engage and expressly state in a digital rights charter, right? So I think we'll start with a round of 3. We'll engage on those. We'll note. So I'm also going to be taking notes. That's why I'm asking for them to be in sections of 3. Please go ahead. You've got the floor.
Hello. I thought what we need to put order into all of the confusing inputs that we can possibly make, which we all heard just now. There are a lot of many different things which we can consolidate under a vision with objectives from which we can then proceed to put all the existing laws in as those which we want to expand or contract. So I would propose that to begin with, we ask ourselves, what do the free media, what do free democratic media, what is their primary objective? It's to tell the truth. And because otherwise they've got no credibility and it's no damn good to do anything because they are sellers out of what and they have no credibility. So the truth is what it's after, and the truth is the prerequisite for democracy. Yes. So this is our primary objective, is to promote and advance democracy with truth. And that leads us to the secondary, objectives, which we need as media to tell the truth and to advance democracy. And those objectives would be freedom of expression, which we exercise in the dissemination of our information. And on the other hand, the opposite side of freedom of expression is free access to information, which encompasses the truth underneath it all, the truth which we can have artificial intelligence confirmed for us by fact-finding, which is the speciality of artificial intelligence. So there are these two basics of freedom of expression, which we must be allowed to exercise without dissemination, and freedom of access to information, which we must have available to us as much as possible, because that's where all the truth comes from, and all the fact-checking can be applied to. And then there's a third target objective. It's not quite an objective, it's the audiences, which are the viewers and the listeners and the readers. They are another important element next to the freedom of expression and the free access to information. And they are our audience whom we should try to expand and enlarge, because we want them to be the future voters who know what the hell they're voting for, instead of harking back to history which was polluted with terrible, terrible things. So those three elements I think we should work from as a basis. And then there's some orderliness in the area of how we disseminate with freedom of expression, and on the one hand, and how we obtain our information with free access to information, which nobody should deny us with fake corruption of even our so-called intelligence. They were the most corrupt of all of the agencies identified by the Zondo Commission. That was our spy organization. But it's all in the interest of our audience, and that audience is our future voters, who should be informed to know exactly what they are voting for, because they are the stakeholders, and more than stakeholders. They are the people that we should serve with humility and integrity.
Thank you. Those are, I think those are key inputs, and they center this relationship between freedom of expression and promoting and advancing democracy, over and above the fact that we are fighting a level of, I don't want to say it's unprecedented level of corruption. I feel like that's too bold a statement. But I think freedom of expression is key in that space. We've got a hand here. Please go ahead.
Is that on? Oh, it's on. Hi, my name is Lerato. I just wanted to make a few contributions. Firstly, to the legislation frameworks. I think there's two that I think we can still include. Firstly, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, especially in reference to takedown notices. I think that should be included, especially in instances where, you know, your digital footprint was formed when you were a little bit younger, and now you're a bit older and you probably don't subscribe to those rules. So takedown notices, which could possibly also include the right to be forgotten, but I think that would sort of feed into the personal PAIA, or personal, the PAIA, privacy rights. And then the second one would be the Protection from Harassment Act. I think it's one of the most underrated in terms of protecting digital rights, but I think the problem with it is because the enforcement, the people who enforce it don't know how to do it. For example, if you're harassed by somebody that you don't know, it's one of the acts that actually empowers the courts to actually unmask, you know, who's behind. But because I don't know whether we don't have the resources, or, you know, people don't know how to do it. So certainly I'll definitely add that. And I think another important one that we need to include in the Digital Rights Charter would be, you know, age assurance versus age verification, I think the ability for people to create as many accounts in one platform, I think that is sometimes, a huge issue for people to get away with a lot, because you can create more than 10 accounts on X without any, verification, without any accountability, because essentially you can sort of get away with it because you can be Lerato X, Lerato Y, all the alphabets. So I think that would be an important one to include. And then I like the aspect you spoke about, theft and IP. So it's one of those topics that I'm currently researching, especially in relation to adult stars or porn stars. It's one of the most, so the porn industry, is, particularly in the US, is one of the biggest in the world. And there's been a lot of conversations about theft of IP and how artificial intelligence is actually stealing some of that content, depending on where you stay on the moral ground. But if we just speak about how artificial intelligence is using that information to create fantasies that can be immoral. As you mentioned, some people try to use it to create TSM. Some people try to create fantasies that are immoral, illegal. So I think that's quite an interesting thing that you mentioned, and I thought we should mention that. And then also, just to add on to the equality, I liked what I think Uyanda said about access to the internet, access to devices. And I think I just wanted to add to it to say access also to parental controls, ensuring that some of these tech companies have default settings that are kid-friendly, because there's so much obligation on parents to be able to be the ones to put in the filtering software. So I would also include cybersecurity software, accessibility of that, because there's so much talk about, oh no, you need to have a VPN, you need to have, but those things are expensive. And for gogos who are constantly receiving spam emails and receiving scams online, but they don't have the necessary tools to actually protect themselves from that harm. So I would add that cybersecurity software as well to be a part of the access when we speak about equality. Thank you.
Thank you for those inputs. I think one, towards the tail end, when you're speaking about sort of phishing, and there's also this need to articulate sort of some level of education around engaging digital spaces, right? Because half the things that we're protecting our parents from are scary. Like, you have to tell your mom, pyramid scheme, delete that. And a lot of the times they're tired of getting the broadcast messages, but you have to read them, because sometimes there's a link and gone is your mom's pension. So there's an imperative need to make the digital space less daunting, particularly in an intergenerational space. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think you've outlined a number of themes for the digital charter. Things like digital safety would need to include a digital footprint, as part of literacy, because people just publish on things and personal stuff on digital platforms, unawares that once you publish something, it's out there, you want to have control of it. So you have to be mindful of your digital footprint and try to manage it so that you don't have your stuff being stolen, kind of things. But also of equal importance is the whole issue of cyber bipolar. I think the charter would need to have a clause that speaks to international relations, the trade war between China and the US is likely to divide the internet so that we don't have internet. You end up with internet for the US Western world, internet for the Far East, and so on and so on. Something that defeats the purpose of internet and access to information. So in the middle of that cyber bipolar war, as South Africa, where do we stand? Is there a need for a position of non-alignment in this case? Thank you.
Thank you for that input. One thing I think I want to touch on two things when it speaks to sort of a digital footprint and the right to be forgotten. I think it's really, really important to place that there's always this sentiment that, you know, your frontal lobe has developed, now you're making better decisions, right? And you would expect that you would have that right to take data and information back. And the other side of that is when you have certain people running for office who you didn't know harbored certain sentiments. And in your vetting process, you look, you check, and you're like, in 2010, this person was actually referring to black people using the K word type of situation, right? And that's the balance that needs to be struck there with the digital footprint. And then it raises questions of legality as well when you think about you're applying for a job, and let's say this job is in finance, and they check now your social media, right? And on your social media, you are either maybe someone who likes to go, you know, you go out, you like to dance, and then they're like, that doesn't really speak to the type of image we want associated with our organization. Is that an invasion of privacy? Is that level of checking linked to a vetting process? What does that speak to in terms of the infringement of someone's personal life? Because I do not come to work in sort of as the person that I am if I'm out with my friends, we're having coffee or whatever. So there seems to be a need where there's a barrier, where what you are in fact verifying is that I am capable of the job, as opposed to sort of this big personality test. Because people say, no, your future employer will see this when you post this. And I'm just like, but why are we sure we want to say your future employer has a right to that, to do that? Like, I'm not giving you all of me, I'm giving you my intellectual ability and that type of thing. So I think that one is important. When you spoke about the theft of intellectual data, right? I also thought about these AI apps that now generate music, and the likeness of those melodies to songs that other people, it's very hard to make music. I can't sing, so for me it's 10 times harder. But it's very, very difficult to put together a song, right? And if you think about something that then almost mimics what that's been done, I'm now starting to sound like I'm very anti-AI, but I'm cautiously optimistic, right? So these are some of, when we unpack, we start to see that even some of the restrictions that we want, or some of the reforms that we want, when we unpack them further, then it starts being like there's two sides to consider. Okay, we'll take another round if we have more inputs. I know there's a hand here. We do have about 12 minutes remaining, so just to say.
So I just wanted to comment on what you just mentioned about, you know, the right to be forgotten and digital footprint. I think, you know, in the way that it exists now in terms of takedown notices, you don't just say, I want a takedown notice. You know, there needs to be some sort of reasoning of why, you know, you want certain content taken down. So for example, in the South African context, you need a court order. So that's the only reason you would get a takedown notice. Once you have a court order, then you're able to send it to, you know, internet service providers to say, hey, I have this court order, and then certain things need to be sort of removed. So I think even within that digital footprint, or the right to be forgotten, there needs to be guidelines to basically follow to say, you know, why is this necessary for you to what are the reasons? Because I think, as you pointed out, we can't make excuses. We can't just use this right to be forgotten, blindly, because some people need to be exposed for exactly who they are and what they stand for. And I think if you're just going to abuse that power to be able to, or abuse that privilege to be able to just have things taken down, there needs to be merit. There needs to be a proper investigation to say why I need to take it down. These are the reasons. This is how it's affected me, before it can just be blindly taken down. So I think I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you for that input. There's a hand at the back. And to also agree with this, the idea that you need a court order. And when you think about the court role, number one, is frustrating, it's full. That's why everyone's doing urgent applications so they can get a date quickly. But even that is discriminatory, because I may not have the resources to go to court, but I really want you to take that down. So there's this need to also expressly state some level of direct access between the person putting the content on and the person affected by that content. The idea of having to make an argument and present evidence as to why I, for example, want an image of me taking down, I'm the one who's harmed by this, I'm the one who's affected by this. Yet, I must draft heads, because it's not enough for me to say I don't want this image of me online, or I don't like this video. And we're having an issue with videos. Everyone's taking videos. Like, you could be crying, having a bad day in a taxi. Someone will record you, post it on TikTok. Everyone's going to make comments. We're praying for you. I didn't agree for you to record me in any moment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just my last bite on the right to take down. In relation to mortality, in African culture, when somebody has passed on, it's not decent to still have his Facebook up and running. So family members should be able to have those rights to take down. Thank you.
There's nothing more jarring than seeing someone who has passed, particularly a celebrity, posting something. You're like, what is this? Why are you posting? Particularly AKA, something's happening with his account.
Thank you so much. I'm exhausted. I think for me, you just touched on, what I was thinking, and especially with, I think there's a lot of laws, and, we they come, we forget about them. Only when something happens, and that's where we go back. And I think, especially around social media, and especially that has to do with young people, because there has been a lot of bullying that has been published in different social medias. And I think we, as NGOs or activists or whatever, we need to come to a point where there is like drastic something that we need to do, because for me it's really concerning that, like you said, so if somebody cries, we go and take a picture. That's the first thing we do. We record. I think we are all journalists, in training. We are good, and it's growing. The phenomenon is growing, and I think even with kids at school, and the hindsight, there's no consequences of what you have done. I mean, the impact of what we have done to the other person, because it can be emotionally draining, where you will have to at least try to get psychological assistance or something if you don't commit suicide. And I think we need to also get to a point where even the government or the people who make the rules or the legislation need to understand that there should be consequences to that. Especially with young people, because we've had a lot of young people committing suicide due to online bullying, or being taken a video and sharing on the social media, and it just fades away, and until something happens, that's where we're like, oh, by the way,
Uh, uh, Thank you for that. And you know, when you think about how much time young people particularly spend on social media and online platforms, it's a lot more than, I'll speak for me because I'm not going to assume people's age in the room. When you've got commitments, like you've got a job and then you've got reports are due, you know, then you have to just run off to the school, check the homework. You're using all your capacity out in a space that is not social media centered, right? And younger people, I feel, have a lot more time that they can use and engage with social media. So the idea that we're always going to tell kids, no, just log off Facebook or just delete it. If someone's bullying you online, delete it, right? There is a point where it's not really practical and necessitates the protections that, you know, you're speaking to. And so I like the point about investigative. We're all investigative journalists now. But what's important about that is, yes, I don't want anyone recording me while I'm crying. I'm having a bad day. But the fact that we can engage with current affairs in ways that are not always controlled is good, because in your community, if something's happening, your ability to take out your phone, record that, particularly if it's illegal activity or corrupt activity, it helps fight back narratives and these fake news that are going to be presented. We're like, we're working hard and we're delivering, but you're like, no, you're not. Look at the state of this, or look at what's happening at this school. Look at the level of dilapidation at this school, right? So it's good and it needs to be managed. And I think these inputs generally speak to a need to trust that the information we are getting is valid. You can verify it, it's true. It is also highlighting the need to protect from harm on the digital spaces. And it actually speaks a little to this idea, and maybe by a possible show of hands, I'd like to know how many people actually consider your social media and digital platforms a safe space? Just knee-jerk reaction. If you consider digital platforms a safe place, please put your hand up. If you consider digital platforms, so either social media or any other, if you consider it safe, put your hand up. To use, safe to use. Safe to use. Or so we are all using with the hope that nothing bad happens, right? And it then speaks to this level of control that we feel we then need to have over that space. The more control we feel like we have in terms of a Facebook, of a Twitter, the better we'll feel about sort of the online environment in and of itself. And the last point is the idea that you don't own your image. It's you, right? It's your face. I posted on social media. Someone can take it from social media and post it elsewhere. And there's this belief that you've now lost the rights to that picture because you posted it on social media. And that, to me, is not something that makes sense. It's something that expressly needs to be protected, because those images then go and they're used for things that I did not consent to. So the idea of consent on digital platforms is something that also needs to be expressed and quite boldly. Yeah, I think we're doing well in terms of the number of outputs. It's looking a bit like a charter in and of itself, to be honest, because you're quite clear in the areas that we need reform. I will take one last hand, my friend. One last input, and then we're going to close this. Is there another? Oh, there's one up there. Sorry, I didn't. Yes, okay. Two more, and then we will close.
Just one more input based on just what you said. So I speak a lot to young children, and I, we speak quite often about the terms and conditions of social media. So I think simplifying that, obviously our laws, consumer laws, obviously speak to that it has to be simple, understandable. So because some people don't understand the legal jargon, that you are actually giving your content to be used in perpetuity. Yeah. For example, people don't understand what in perpetuity means. So simplifying, ensuring that those terms and conditions, firstly, are not so long, and then number two, that they're actually simplified so that people actually understand how they work. Also, unpacking what these terms and conditions mean, because sometimes you'll be downloading an app that has nothing to do with your gallery, but it wants permissions to your gallery. So also just having that consciousness of, okay, I'm downloading an app, I wanted to track my to-do list, for example. It's got nothing to do with your contacts. It's got nothing to do with your gallery. It's got nothing to do with your whatever you're listening to. So also just simplifying that, and also being able to, I guess it also boils down to information literacy and digital literacy. That people need to understand that when I'm saying I accept, this is what I'm accepting. And obviously in a diverse country like ourselves, I would also say maybe for those terms and conditions to exist in all official languages, so that people are able to understand what they're actually getting themselves into. That was my last thing.
Agreed. Particularly translated.
All right, thanks very much. Confessions, I'm a flipping digital illiterate and proud to be, because I come from a stone age of typewriter, later fax. When you speak about children spending more time or excessive time online, and there's also some were exposed to gambling online, and which is quite serious. And as someone who, you know, I'm just Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and that's all. The rest I don't know. I left them to my kids, or Instagram. So, but I love, you know, the space we engage digitally and the pros and cons of it. I'm just thinking aloud that one of the aspects that we must emphasize is digital detox, where at some point you must literally cut off this fake social life that, you know, because you spend 2 hours, when you go out, you see the real world out there. That is not what it is. It is flipping fictitious and very misleading. Yeah, I think something that when you talk about digital literacy, digital education, we must emphasize the issue of just detoxing on this, because it can be very toxic sometimes. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that input, particularly around detoxing. And it makes me think of brain rot. I didn't know that was a thing. And I actually watched what it is when you're watching brain rot. And I mean, you have to watch for a long period of time for it to start affecting sort of your capacity, your reasoning capacity and whatever. But when you look at the brain rot and you look at how much time kids spend, not only does it create this unrealistic idea of what life is, but it also limits their ability to sort of engage and think critically. It's also why maybe personally I have an issue with an over-reliance on apps like ChatGPT. There are certain skills, let's say you're a writer, that you need to develop, that you won't develop if you don't actually work on it. So that idea of a typewriter, that's good in a way, like once in a while, get on the typewriter, don't have predictive text, don't have autocorrect, and actually let's see where your spelling is. You know, maybe that's an issue. You might find that you don't know how to spell half the words you think you can spell because something is actually predicting them for you. And that's a sort of a skill that you need to capacitate and develop. But thank you, MMA, for putting this session together, particularly around the needs for this charter. A lot of times we are reacting in the digital space and social media. It's moving at a rate that's faster than what we have in place. So this is a step in the right direction. In terms of solidifying what we want to see and how we want to be engaged on digital platforms. And thank you to everyone here for participating. I thought I was the only one scared of socials.
Thank you so much, Naledi, and thank you so much to everyone here who has participated. I think it's going to be an incredible charter. The next steps obviously are going to be for us to work on it, put it together, draft it, and then we will share it far and wide so that you can also have a read. And then obviously come back MFF 2026 where we can carry this conversation forward. We are not done for the day. We do have a program break now, but we will be coming back 5:30 for 6. We have an incredible session planned for tonight, and not to mention lots of drinks, food, and live music. So we will see each and every single one of you. I will keep an eye out for you. We will see you tonight here at 6 p.m. Thank you. And thank you, Naledi and Uyanda, who is not in the room anymore. But yeah. Thank you so much. That was so great. Yeah, I have a goodie bag for you. You right? Me too. Yeah, thank you. I think, are you coming back later?